Well, we're looking at biblical eschatology, big word, which means the study of last things. And here we deal with the subjects of physical death and the intermediate state of the dead and the final state or eternal state. So we come tonight to what's called in theology the intermediate state. Now, the subject deals with the question, where are the dead? The body, as we've already seen, is in the grave, but where is the spirit or the person? That's the question we'll be dealing with. Where are the dead after the death of the body? So, in reality, the intermediate state, we're dealing with the period of personal existence. The period of personal existence between death and the resurrection. A lot of erroneous teaching. Some of the cults, for example, teach soul sleep. At death, the spirit or soul is asleep until the final day of resurrection. Others teach annihilation of the wicked. I'm thinking now of religious teachings. And then there is the familiar Roman Catholic teaching of purgatory. That's where they go. Everybody. Except maybe the Pope. Someone maybe who's canonized, a saint and that sort of thing, would be able to escape like the Pope's purgatory. But all the others have to go there. A lot of confusion. Well, let's look at the terms. Trust you'll take some notes on this because this is one of the most perplexing areas of understanding that people, Christians, have of the whole Bible. It is astounding how few Christians know where Christians are after they die. And this confusing state of where is the spirit at death. We'll look first at the terms. For the intermediate state, we're not talking about the eternal state. Keep that in mind. In the Old Testament, the term, English first, Sheol. And since so many of you have had Hebrew here, we give you the privilege of seeing it written in Hebrew, Sheol. In the New Testament, the term is Hades. Actually, it's Hades, but you said the rich man was in Hades, Luke 16. People might look at you a little odd. But isn't that Hades? Certainly. You Greek scholars. The intermediate state is called Sheol in the Old Testament, Hades in the New. We're asking, where are the dead between death and resurrection? That's the subject of study. Now, I don't know about some of the versions you're using, but the King James really murders these two words. I like the King James, but at this point it's a bit misleading. The word hell is an English word, so that never occurs in the Bible. It's in the translations, but that's an English word. Hebrew didn't know what hell was, nor the Greek. You should know this. The King James Version mistranslates Sheol as hell 31 times. Translates Sheol as hell 31 times. And mistranslates Sheol as grave 31 times. Just so happens it worked out that way. They translate the one term as hell 31 times and as grave 31 times. It doesn't mean either one of those things. It doesn't mean either one. No possible way it could mean either one of those. Because the Hebrew had other words for grave, and no word for hell because it was not a Old Testament revelation, not fully anyway. It mistranslates, King James, Hades, word Hades, mistranslates it as hell 9 times and as grave once. So you've got 72 times that you really don't know where the people are at when they die. The next thing we have to see is that Sheol, Hades, and we'll be using the phrase like this often because we'll see their synonyms. We'll be talking about Sheol, Hades, because in the Old Testament that was the Hebrew word, the New Testament that's the Greek word. And so Sheol, Hades is a common biblical word for the place of departed spirits. Now that's the most important thing you'll learn if we close down shop tonight on the subject. That would be what you need to know. That Sheol, Hades, does not mean grave or hell. It means the place of the departed spirits at death. It means the spirit realm of the dead. The realm of the dead, spirit. Dead who are spirits. The two terms, Sheol, Hades, do not mean grave or hell because, as I said, the Old Testament and New have terms for both grave and hell. Grave in the Old Testament, kever, grave in the Old Testament is kever. See, no relation to the word Sheol or hell or Hades or anything else. It means grave. Then the New Testament term for grave, we're talking about grave, is menemayon. Means sepulcher or tomb. Of course, same as grave. The King James versions and other versions make some mistranslation on Sheol, Hades at times. But anyway, Sheol, Hades is mistranslated as grave and as hell many times in the King James Version. In no case ever does Sheol or Hades mean either grave or hell. Hell is the eternal place, as we'll see, of punishment for the wicked. And Hades is an intermediate state for spirits. So these are the words in Old and New Testament for grave, and grave is the place of the body during the intermediate period. Don't confuse the place where the body is and where the spirit is. Grave is where the body is during the intermediate period. Now we come to the word hell, and we'll deal with it more later, but I have to mention it at this stage. Is an English word from heli. And if you do word studies, you can go into more detail, but basically it means a hall, H-A-L-L, a hall. And that word that hall comes from a word which means to cover or hide. So the idea of hell is where, they're covered over and hidden away and in punishment. The basic meaning is what we're giving you now. Hell is an English word. It isn't a scriptural word at all. They're good words for what we mean by hell, so don't get ahead of us if you're new here tonight. We believe in what they mean by hell when they mistranslate these words, some of them. We believe in a place because the Bible teaches it, but it has other words, other terms. Now, hell, using the term that's popular, is the final place of punishment for the wicked after the intermediate state ends. So you should never confuse Hades or Sheol with hell. Hell, in the meaning of the term that we use it that way, is the final place of punishment for the wicked after the intermediate state is over. We'll say more about it later to clear up the confusion that it isn't hell. Sheol, Hades isn't hell. The term for hell in the New Testament is Gehenna. Now sometimes it's properly translated hell. The only word in the New Testament that means hell in our understanding of hell is this word that Jesus used, and the New Testament used, Gehenna, and then in Revelation it's also called lake of fire. But we'll get to those a little later. But Hades is never Gehenna or lake of fire. They're two different places. One is the intermediate state, and one is the final state of the wicked. But Hades and hell are not to be equated like one is just an intermediate state of the other, because, as we'll see a little later, both the righteous and the wicked went into Sheol, Hades. But there was a separation after they got there, but that's getting ahead of the story. In the New Testament, what we call hell is only properly translated when the word Gehenna occurs in the Greek, or lake of fire is never translated as hell. It's simply called lake of fire. In the Old Testament, the full teaching on The final state is not unfolded. The final state, Gehenna, hell, lake of fire. What we mean by hell, Gehenna, lake of fire, is not fully unfolded, but it's there. The final state is there, but as many doctrines in the New Testament have their foundation in the Old, they're simply foundational in the Old, and many, many doctrines, if not, we could say all of them, don't have their completion in the Old Testament, but the New. But you can see it there. For example, we're talking about the final state that comes out in the New Testament as Gehenna, hell, lake of fire, is there in the Old Testament. You see it like in Isaiah chapters 24 through 27, where it speaks of the final day of judgment. Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. Verse 3, the land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for the Lord has spoken it. And he goes on, speaking of the judgment upon the earth. In that day, chapter 26, in the day of the Lord, there'll be sore and great and strong sword shall punish, and so on. So if you'll take the time to read Isaiah 24 through 27, you'll see there is described in the Old Testament a vivid description of the final day of destruction and judgment. So there was a pretty fair understanding that death didn't end it all for the wicked, or the righteous for that matter. Then if you'll turn to Daniel 12 and verse 2, you'll see that there is an understanding in the Old Testament of a final resurrection and punishment of the wicked and blessing for the righteous. Now this is far back in the Old Testament days, but still they had some understanding. Look at this prophecy, Daniel 12:2. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. You see, it isn't a full picture of what Jesus taught when he came, taught about the wicked going into hell and the righteous into paradise and eternal life and so on. But there it is. You see, it's there for the pious Israelite to see, as well as the pious, studious Christian to see, if he wants to study these things. Then in Isaiah 66, verses 22 to 24, here Isaiah gives the same imagery that Jesus uses. Or to say it another way, Jesus picks up the imagery of Isaiah 66 to describe Gehenna or hell. He uses the same figure, so of course he got it from the Old Testament since he inspired it. Isaiah 66, 22 to 24. For the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, and so shall your seed and your name remain. So here he speaks, see, of an eternal state, a new heaven, new earth. Now that's Old Testament teaching, that this earth was not all there is. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. Now look at this. And they, meaning the righteous, shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me, for their worm shall not die, and neither shall their fire be quenched. See, that's the exact imagery that Jesus uses, like in Mark, if you turn over to Mark 9. See, Jesus got a lot of his teaching right out of the Old Testament, naturally, because he was fulfilling it, as well as giving the fuller meanings many times. Mark 9, 43 to 44. If thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It's better for thee to enter into life maimed than to have two hands to go into Gehenna, is what he said, not hell, because that's an English word. To go into Gehenna, into the fire that shall never be quenched. Now look at this right out of Isaiah, where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched. So, while the Old Testament does not have complete revelation of the eternal state or the final state of the righteous and wicked, it's there. Now I deal in much detail, giving all of the necessary references in the course that I used to teach in seminary, Old Testament Theology. But this will give you sufficient here to show you that the final state that Jesus called Gehenna or lake of fire is also set forth in the Old Testament. But it's there, of course, in embryo. I don't want to get into the details too much because I say it's in another course, Old Testament theology. But there is a Hebrew word, Abaddon, that occurs in Revelation 9. And it's a place of destruction. So there's a sense in which it's even there, but it's certainly not clearly taught. But in the New Testament, there's no question that Hades and Gehenna are two different words. They don't even look alike. And lake of fire is a descriptive term of Gehenna, where the fire dieth not. All right, in the third place, we talked about the terms and the meaning of Sheol, Hades. Third place, Sheol, Hades. See, either one, whether you're talking about the Old Testament, it'd be Sheol, New Testament, Hades. Sheol, Hades is the place of departed spirits. And it's seen to be that because the Sheol and Hades have the same meaning in Scripture. Sheol, Hades, as the place of departed spirits, have the same meaning in Scripture. They're not two different places. The same. We'll give you a few reasons for that, why we know they're the same. First of all, 2nd century BC, that's before Christ, translators, 70 Jewish scholars, translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And that translation came to be known as the Septuagint. What happened, see, Alexander the Great conquered the world. And, of course, Greek became the common language. That didn't mean that people didn't continue to speak, some of them Hebrew and that sort of thing, Aramaic, but Greek became the common language, like English is really the common language for most of the world. So Hebrew was dying out as the language of the Hebrew religion. And the Jews were getting to the place where they could no longer read their Old Testament in Hebrew, but they did speak and read Greek. This many years had to pass for this to transpire, of course, like a century. So 70 scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, were appointed to make a Greek translation of the Hebrew. Like you're reading an English translation of the Hebrew in the Old Testament and an English translation of the Greek in the New. See, unless you know the languages, you're always reading somebody's opinion. Well, God understands that. You can get saved on anybody's opinion if they're translating the Bible. I haven't found a Bible that you couldn't get saved out of. Some of them are poor excuses for translations, but you can find John 3:16 pretty accurate in all of them. In practically every case, and let's say in 21 cases where Sheol occurs in the Hebrew, when they translated that in their Greek translated, they always translate it with Hades. So Jews ought to know what Greek word. These scholars spoke and wrote excellent, perfect Hebrew. See, Hebrew scholars. But they're also Greek scholars. So the word they chose to translate Sheol was Hades. 21 times in the Septuagint. Twice it's translated as death, but still you're in the realm of the same idea. Then another reason we know the Sheol, Hades has the same meaning, and we're going to see a little later that both the righteous and the wicked went to Sheol. And they translated that as Hades. And we get the idea in our mind, and I suppose most Christians, and again we say it in love, but we have to say it, most churches don't teach enough to carry you through Sunday, let alone the week. And so they've got the idea of Hades as being the place where the wicked go. Well, why did Jesus say he had the keys to Hades? He wouldn't need them if the wicked were there. And why did he say the gates of Hades will not prevail against the Christian, my church? Because Christians are involved with Hades, Sheol. But we'll get to that a little later. We're trying to establish that the Hebrew scholars translated Sheol with Hades. They had a lot of words if they wanted to make Sheol hell or Gehenna or whatever, they'd have it, you know. Although that's a little premature for anybody that's alert. Jesus is the first one that used Gehenna as hell. But that's the first thing. Septuagint translators identified Hades with Sheol, obviously. And secondly, you compare Psalm 16:10 with Acts 2:27-31. And we'll do that, won't we? Acts 2:27-31. Psalm 16:10 will show you that Sheol, Hades, has to be the same place. Well, it's too bad we don't all have our Hebrew and Greek Bibles, but you'll just have to take our word for the fact that when we read a word here and say that isn't hell, that's Sheol, that's precisely what it is. But we'll let you go look it up. Even in the version, some of the new versions ought to translate it properly. What's the New American Standard Version do with Psalm 16:10? Does it translate as Sheol? Sheol? Well, the New American Standard Version we recommend you buy for your study. But notice what King James says, "For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell." Well, there's where some of the, again, erroneous teaching comes that Jesus went to hell. It's too bad they don't read Hebrew Greek. I mean, you should never set yourself up to be a teacher if you're too lazy, indifferent to study the languages, because you're always a parrot of the commentaries or what someone's written. Now, I don't say God cannot use a person who can't read the languages. But I'm talking about the gift and office of teacher, not the ability to teach. God can use a lot of people to teach, but the teacher, I'm persuaded, will be able to read the languages sufficiently not to get up and say Jesus went to hell, because this is a messianic psalm, and of course it's quoted of Jesus in the New Testament, Acts 2, speaking of Jesus' death and resurrection. So we know it's messianic. If you got my Bible, it's got a star right here by this verse. That means a messianic prophecy. But I knew it before I saw the star, because I've studied messianic prophecy. Well, anyway, if you know New Testament, the book of Acts, this is quoted directly out of the Old Testament and applies it to Jesus. "But thou wilt not leave my soul in Sheol." That's what it said. Sheol, the place of departed spirits. That's where his spirit or soul went. To Sheol, not the grave. "Thou wilt not leave my soul in Sheol, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption." The body in the grave. His body did not see corruption. Now, if you turn to Acts 2:27-31, here's a direct quotation. Acts 2:27, "Because thou wilt not leave my soul in Hades." It's translated in my King James as hell again. But American Standard Version, don't you have Hades here? Right, so your New American Standard is Hades, like the American Standard is Hades. And of course, in the seminary, we didn't use King James. We only used the American Standard Version. And that version, like the New American Standard, which is the same thing, but it's a later translation, translates these words properly as Sheol and Hades. But you'll notice here that since this is Hades, he says, "Thou wilt not leave my soul in Hades, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption." Now, it's easy to put it together. Psalm 16:10 said, "You will not leave my soul in Sheol." When Peter preaches the sermon, he says, quotes the Old Testament, but he's talking now with the Greek, and he says, "You'll not leave my soul," in quoting that prophecy, in Hades. So there's no way to get around that Peter identified Sheol with Hades. We know Peter was inspired. We know Peter was an apostle. We don't know about the 70. I'm sure God directed in that like he did in the King James Version and some of the other translations. The Septuagint's a translation. It's translation of the Hebrew into the Greek. But it's another thing when you've got the apostles' word for it. Although it ought to be pretty obvious. If you've studied the whole subject of the Septuagint, you'll see that God certainly directed in that. Keep the Old Testament alive among Greek-speaking Jews. You've got to keep in mind, and this is where the confusion comes in if you don't, keep in mind Sheol, Hades, is not the place of the righteous wicked. It is a description of where departed spirits go. It's just like saying whether they're saved or unsaved. Well, they've gone, they're gone, they've departed. That's all you're saying. You haven't said where they are when they departed. They're on the other side, but there's two sides to the other side and a great gulf between them. They couldn't say just grave because they know the body is in the sepulcher and the tomb and the grave. Sheol, Hades, means the place of departed spirits. Instead of saying place, that sounds like a place. It's the realm where the departed spirits are. What's that realm called? Sheol, if you're a Jew. If you were Greek in the New Testament days, you'd said Hades. But the description of the realm is the realm of departed spirits. Place is a little too localized. The realm of departed spirits. So there are two evidences that Sheol, Hades are the same. And then the implication in Matthew 16 and Revelation 1 and Revelation 20. They're seen to be the same by implication in Matthew 16, Revelation 1, Revelation 20. Now we'll look at those three passages. I'm saying Sheol, Hades are seen to be the same by implication in the third place, by the implied meaning in what Jesus said in these passages, or what is said in these passages. That Sheol, Hades is not the place of punishment, but terms describing the realm of departed spirits. Matthew 16:18, after Peter made his confession, then Jesus said, "Thou art Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it," against his church. And we're the church. Remember, that isn't a building or a denomination. But the gates of Hades will not prevail against the body of Christ, which is made up of individuals. It's not my church. Christendom will be out there until I return. But that the gates of Hades, he said, will not prevail against us. Now that's the first passage, and keep that in mind as we look at Revelation 1:18. This is the vision John has of the risen, ascended, exalted, glorified Christ. Revelation 1:18. Jesus is speaking. "I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore." Amen. "And have the keys of Hades and death." Not hell as in King James, but Hades and death. He's letting us know he has life, and he's alive forevermore. And he says, I've got both the keys to the experience of death and the realm of the dead, Hades. And then Revelation 20, where we see, and this only has meaning for a Christian, Revelation 20, verse 11, "I saw a great white throne and him that sat on it. I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were open. The sea gave up their dead, which were in it. Death and Hades delivered up their dead, which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works." Now verse 14, "And death and Hades were cast into hell," into the lake of fire. I said by implication, Sheol, Hades is seen to be the same place here. Because as we'll see in further study, both the righteous and the wicked go to Sheol, Hades, but they're separated after they get there, since you're only speaking of the realm of the dead. But Jesus is saying here that the gates of Hades, the realm where departed spirits go, will not prevail against his church. He has both the key to death, which is the experience or the door into the realm of the dead, Hades. He said, I've got the keys both of death and the realm of the dead. Now, if the righteous were not there, it wouldn't mean anything. If it's just the wicked in Hades, Sheol, Hades, or just Hades, as most Christians conceive of Hades being a place where only the wicked go to, well, then what are these promises to us, to Christians? See, death is the door to Hades the realm of the dead. That's why he uses these two things together, death and Hades. I've overcome death and Hades. I've got the key to death and Hades. Death and Hades are both cast at the end time into the lake of fire. What he's saying is, by my resurrection, I've conquered death in the body. I've got the key to that. He said, my resurrection's the key, and you'll have one like it. I know what the key is to coming back to life. So, by the resurrection, I've got the keys to death, and by my shed blood and death at Calvary, Hades can no longer hold the spirits of the righteous. Now, Hades is not a place of punishment, although the wicked are punished in there, but it's a place of departed spirits. Or, to make it as plain as we can make it, he's saying when he casts the experience of death into the lake of fire and Hades, the realm of departed spirits, into the lake of fire, he's saying that no Christian will ever again, Revelation 20, will ever again experience death or enter the realm of the dead, the realm of departed spirits. Because he casts death and the realm of where people go when they die, Hades, into the lake of fire, because both death and the dead realm belong to hell or to the devil and those who have the power of death. So death is the door to Hades, which is the realm of the dead. And Jesus said, the realm of the dead, Hades, cannot prevail against my people, my church. He said, I have the keys both to death and to the realm of the dead, Hades. And in the end, he says, I'll cast both into the lake of fire. Well, you see, Christians are still dying. So that lake of fire comes after tribulation, after the millennium, at the close of the millennium. As those of you who've studied the book of Revelation know, in fact, Revelation 20, you can go home and read it, and you'll see that it does come after the 1,000-year period of his reign. So Sheol, Hades, is not a place of punishment. It's a realm of departed spirits, although in that realm the righteous are blessed and the wicked are in punishment, as will be evident as we move along.
You say that the righteous are blessed. Well, what about when Jesus said to the man on the cross, today you'll be with me? Does that not mean is there a separation there between Jesus and the righteous, or what?
Hades is not a place. It's the realm of departed spirits. That's why we repeat a lot of things a lot of times. And that isn't criticism, but it's necessary. Once you get in your mind that the Sheol, Hades, we could forget those terms. It's like if you said to me, where is brother so-and-so? Well, he's with the Lord, or he died. See, that's all you've said. He's in that realm. He's departed. But as you study, make an inductive study of Old and New Testament, which is what theology is all about, a systematic, inductive, and deductive study, you see that how Sheol is used, it says the wicked are there, it says the righteous are there, but you see the wicked are not happy. But the righteous are blessed, both in Old and New Testament. So we know there's a separation, but that's what we're coming to right now. Both the righteous and the wicked are in Sheol, Hades, but the Bible shows a separation between them. A separation between the righteous and the wicked in Sheol, Hades. Sheol if you're talking about Old Testament, Hades if New. So in the realm of the dead, the righteous and the wicked both die. Their bodies both go to the grave, but their spirits are seen to be in one case with God and the other in rather distressing circumstances. Remember, the Old Testament doesn't have a clear teaching on theology about any subject, and that includes intermediate state, final state, but it's there. First of all, let's show that both the righteous and the wicked go to Sheol, and then we'll show the separation. First of all, here's one passage. You could get a concordance and look up all the passages on Sheol, and you'd find a lot. Genesis 37:35. Now, Jacob is the father of Israel, became father of the nation of Israel, and he ought to know where he's going. I think he had quite a bit of light. So look at what he says. Now, Jacob certainly was a righteous man, Old Testament saint, chosen of God, elect. And in Genesis 37:35, he's lost his son and he's weeping. Verse 35, and all of his sons and all of his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, for I will go down into Sheol unto my son mourning. Now it's translated here in King James grave, but it's the Hebrew Sheol. He says, I'm going to go down into Sheol unto my son. He thought his son was dead. You know, Joseph was sold into Egypt, and he's mourning for him. And he said, I'll go down to where he is in Sheol, the place of departed spirits. So there's a righteous man. And he thought Joseph was there, and he himself said he was going there. Now let's see if the wicked are in the same place. Psalm 9:17 is one of many examples. Psalm 9:17. By the way, old Jacob didn't think he was going to hell. Didn't think Joseph had gone there. So obviously, it's what it is. It's the realm of departed spirits that he was going to. Psalm 9:17. Let's see if the wicked are there. The wicked shall be turned into Sheol, and all the nations that forget God. Translated, King James hell, but again it's Sheol, as your versions, later versions will show you. Well, obviously they're both there, and you could just take, if you want an hour, go home, look up the references, you'll find both righteous and wicked are in Sheol. But that's just the realm of the dead, where the spirits are. But where, we're just in Old Testament now, where are the righteous and wicked in the Old Testament? Well, the wicked are seen to be in places called, for example, the pit. Now, no righteous person is ever said to be in the pit. Remember Revelation 20, the pit's where the devil and his angels and the wicked are. The pit. It's just a synonym for hell, really. Comes to be that. It's called the pit. It's called lowest Sheol. The wicked are in lowest Sheol. They're said to be in the depths of Sheol. They're not just in Sheol, but they're in the depths of it. Sometimes it's said they're in the sides of the pit in Sheol. Let's look at some of these passages. Proverbs 9:13-18. Talking about the lost, unsaved, wicked. Both the righteous and wicked go to Sheol. That's just the realm of the dead. But they're separated after they get there. And no righteous person is ever said to be in the pit or lowest Sheol or in the nether regions of the pit or any of these other expressions. Proverbs 9:13-18. Verse 18 is what we want, but it won't hurt to read the other. Now this is good instruction. That's why we're reading a few verses with verse 18. A foolish woman is clamorous. She is simple and knoweth nothing. For she sitteth at the door of her house. He's talking about a harlot, a prostitute, on a seat in the high places of the city to call passengers who go right on their ways. Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. As for him that wanteth understanding, she saith to him, he that lacketh understanding, she saith to him, stolen waters are sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he knoweth not, that foolish person that goes into a prostitute, he knoweth not that the dead are there, and that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. See, not just in Sheol, but those who traffic with women of ill repute, they go to the depths of Sheol. The dead are there. Well, they're all dead, righteous or wicked, but the wicked go into the depths. You'll find a lot of expressions like this in the Old Testament, like Isaiah 14:15, speaking of the wicked nation of Babylon. Isaiah 14, verse 15, and how God is going to judge her and destroy her. In verse 15, speaking of Babylon, who's exalted herself above everything, he says, yet you'll be brought down to Sheol, to the sides of the pit. See, the nation of Babylon, which means people, will be brought down to Sheol, to the sides of the pit. So the pit is in Sheol. But that's in that realm of the dead. Sheol isn't the pit because the righteous go there. Then in Deuteronomy 32, verses 16-22, he shows that the wicked are to be punished in Sheol. Deuteronomy 32, 16 to 22. He speaks here of how Israel provoked him, followed after strange gods, worshipped and sacrificed demons, kept provoking God. And we read right on down to verse 22. And what's he going to do with them? A fire is kindled in mine anger, and shall burn unto the lowest Sheol, and consume, you see. So God is going to find those wicked and disobedient who die, and the fire is going to burn them even in the lowest Sheol. So the depths of Sheol, the lowest Sheol, you see, these are terms to describe like the sides of the pit and so forth, where the wicked are in Sheol. By the way, that shows they're in punishment in Sheol, because the fire is going to get to them there. Then in Ezekiel chapter 32, we have one of the clearest teachings of the intermediate state in all the Old Testament. Have quite a long passage in Ezekiel 32 where the wicked are in Sheol. They're in Sheol, but they're described as being in the pit in Sheol, in the sides of the pit, and in shame. Ezekiel 32, verse 17. This is a prophecy concerning Egypt and some of the other nations. It came to pass also in the 12th year, in the 15th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, wail for the multitude of Egypt, and cast them down, even her and the daughters of the famous nations, unto the nether parts of the earth. See, there it's called the nether parts. Not just buried in the grave, but down to the nether parts of the earth, with them that go down into the pit. Whom dost thou pass in beauty, speaking to Egypt? Go down and be thou laid with the uncircumcised. See, Egypt was a great, powerful nation, great splendor, wealth, power, gold, wisdom. He says, whom do you pass in beauty? Well, he says, you go down and be laid with the uncircumcised in the pit. They shall fall in the midst of them that are slain by the sword. She is delivered to the sword. Draw her and all of her multitudes. The strong among the mighty shall speak to him out of the midst of Sheol. You see where the pit is? In the nether regions of the earth, it's in Sheol. The strong and the mighty shall speak to him out of the midst of Sheol, with them that help him. They are gone down, they lie uncircumcised, slain by the sword. Of course, the idea of being uncircumcised here is shame, not an Israelite. Asher, Assyria is there. He's talking about who are in the pit in Sheol. Well, Assyria is there. And all her company, her graves are about him, all of them slain, fallen by the sword, whose graves are set in the sides of the pit, and her company is round about her grave, all of them slain, fallen by the sword, which caused terror in the land of the living. And Elam is there, and all her multitudes round about her grave, that is the nation, and all of them slain, fallen by the sword, which are gone down uncircumcised into the nether parts of the earth, which caused terror, their terror in the land of the living, yet they've borne their shame with them that go down to the pit. They're in Sheol, but they're in the pit. They have set her a bed in the midst of the slain with all of her multitudes. Her graves are round about him, all of them uncircumcised, slain by the sword, though their terror was caused in the land of the living. Yet have they borne their shame with them that go down to the pit. He is put in the midst of them that be slain. And there is Meshach and Tubal and all her multitude. Her graves are round about him. All of them uncircumcised, slain by the sword, though they caused their terror in the land of the living. These are all mighty nations. But he says they're all just going to be laid down in the sides of the pit. Speaking here of their spirits, though he uses the figure of grave in the pit, which is a contradiction, but it's a spiritual application. They're all going to be down there with the uncircumcised, and the great, the kings and the nobles and all alike be with those who are in shame, though they cause terror in the land of the living. Verse 27, they shall not lie with the mighty that are fallen of the uncircumcised. Speaking of these nations he's mentioning, there's even degrees, you see, in the pit. As Jesus said, there are degrees of punishment in the New Testament. But he said, these nations will not lie. They shall not lie with the mighty that are fallen of the uncircumcised, non-Israelites, which are gone down to Sheol with their weapons of war, and they've laid their swords under their heads, but their iniquities shall be upon their bones, though they wear terror of the mighty in the land of the living. Yea, thou shalt be broken in the midst of the uncircumcised, and shall lie with them that are slain with the sword. And there's Edom and her kings, and all her princes, which with their might are laid with them that were slain by the sword. They shall lie with the uncircumcised, and with them that go down to the pit. And there be the princes of the north, all of them, and all the Sidonians, which are gone down with the slain, with their terror. They are ashamed of their might, and they lie uncircumcised with them that be slain by the sword, and bear their shame with them that go down to the pit. And Pharaoh shall see them, and shall be comforted over all his multitude, even Pharaoh and his army slain by the sword, saith the Lord. For I have caused my terror in the land of the living, and he shall be laid in the midst of the uncircumcised, O Pharaoh himself, with them that are slain with the sword, even Pharaoh and all of his multitude, saith the Lord. So here is the most vivid description in all the Old Testament. In fact, you've got more of a description even than the New Testament. Jesus just talks about hell, Gehenna, and lake of fire, but there's a description of certain nations that God is judging them according to their works always, of course. And certain nations are not just in Sheol, but they're in the pit, and they're not just in the pit, they're in the lowest parts of the pit. And some of the great kings like Pharaoh will not be permitted to lie with the great kings that have lived, though lost and uncircumcised, which is tantamount to saying they're lost when they're uncircumcised. That's the significance of that. But some leaders won't be allowed to lie in the pit in their punishment with those of other nations who are perhaps not as wicked. And you could go on, you see, and show that while both the righteous and wicked go to Sheol, there is a separation there. A separation.